How many times have you felt a pain you couldn't explain? Not physical, but that internal restlessness, as if something inside you was trying to scream for attention. Such moments are often interpreted as bad luck, punishment, or simply a tide of misfortune. But what if this is just a signal? What if life is actually trying to wake you up? Carl Jung, one of the greatest names in depth psychology, invites us to look at pain with different eyes. For him, pain is not a punishment, but an attempt by our psyche to make us stop, look inward, and change the direction of our lives. It's not just about tragedies or significant events. Sometimes what seems to be just a constant irritation, a mild and persistent sadness, an unexplained impatience, all these are small whispers from the unconscious. They are disguised messages trying to say, you are living on autopilot. In the rush of everyday life, immersed in goals that are not always ours, and in routines that we simply repeat, we forget to listen to what really matters. Pain then enters the scene as an alert. It forces us to slow down, to question, to seek meaning where before there was only repetition. And at that moment, uncomfortable though it may be, something begins to transform. Pain is a language, and like any language, it wants to communicate something. The unconscious uses this tool when our consciousness insists on ignoring what needs to be seen. Perhaps you are in a job that no longer makes sense, or in a relationship that only survives on the surface. Perhaps you have distanced yourself so much from yourself that you can no longer remember what really makes you feel alive. Pain does not come to destroy. It comes to interrupt a process that, if continued, would take you further and further away from your essence. This is where true awakening begins. When we stop seeing pain as an enemy and begin to listen to it as an ally, we open a space for self-knowledge. This discomfort that arises is not trying to hurt you. It's trying to show you where you have stopped looking. And as uncomfortable as it may be, this is the first step to rediscovering what you have lost of yourself along the way. As we dive into this silent call of pain, we begin to realize that it is not just pulling us inward. It is pointing to a specific place, that which we avoid facing in ourselves. Carl Jung called this the shadow. And it's not something mystical or distant, but real and living aspects of our psyche that have been excluded from our consciousness. The shadow is composed of everything that, at some point, was not accepted. Insecurities we try to hide, traits of selfishness we deny, explosive reactions we justify with the behavior of others. It carries all the repressed contents that, out of fear or shame, we sweep under the mental rug. But the problem is that what is repressed does not disappear. It only finds other ways to manifest itself. And pain is one of those ways. When we feel recurring discomforts, when our decisions seem to always lead us to the same kind of frustration, when we are dominated by reactions we don't understand, there is the shadow, acting between the lines of our lives. And ignoring it is like trying to drive a car looking only through the rearview mirror. Sooner or later, we find ourselves in cycles that seem to have no end. It is at this point that we understand. Pain is not trying to punish us, but rather to lead us to the shadow. It is an invitation to rescue parts of ourselves that have been forgotten, denied, or distorted. And the more we resist this invitation, the more intense the pain becomes. Because as long as the shadow is not seen, it will continue to scream, sometimes through failure, anxiety, relationships that hurt us, or the constant feeling of being out of place, even when everything seems to be right on the outside. This journey is not easy. Looking at the shadow requires courage, because it's like turning on a light in a room we've avoided entering for years. But it is also liberating. For there, in the heart of pain, are important clues about who we really are and what still needs to be embraced within us. This is how pain transforms into direction. It guides us to this profound encounter with our forgotten parts, where, paradoxically, we find not only what frightens us, but also what completes us. And as we accept this, the path opens for a real transformation, which continues when we stop fighting against this shadow and start observing it more closely. And it is at this moment, when observing this shadow closely, that something changes. What before seemed like just a set of flaws or defects begins to gain a new interpretation. What we deny in ourselves is not necessarily our bad side. In fact, the shadow is not an enemy. On the contrary, it is a kind of guide, a mirror that reflects with surgical precision everything that needs to be recognized and integrated so that we can truly evolve. Jung did not see the shadow as something to be fought, but as a bridge between who we are today and who we have the potential to be. When we ignore this part, we become hostages to automatic reactions. We judge others severely. We get irritated with simple situations. We create instant antipathies that we cannot even explain. These signs are not random. They are clues, revelations of what still needs to be understood within us. Facing the shadow is observing, honestly, why certain people bother us so much, why we are so shaken by criticism, why we feel envy, jealousy, anger. These are the reactions that point us to what is still hidden, to the pieces we reject, but which remain alive and active, influencing our behaviors without us realizing it. It's not about blaming or shaming yourself. The process of self-knowledge has no room for self-punishment. What there is, in fact, is the possibility of transforming these internal contents into learning. Each time we recognize a shadow, we take a step toward wholeness. And this doesn't make us better, but rather more complete, more human, more conscious. This kind of outlook requires maturity. It requires a willingness to stop placing responsibility on the external world and start investigating what happens within us, especially when something throws us off balance. It's not about controlling everything, but about understanding that there is meaning behind our discomforts. When we accept that the shadow is not an obstacle but a portal, we begin to see emotional discomfort as an opportunity. It's as if, instead of hiding from what scares us, we decide to walk towards it with curiosity. Because it is precisely there, in what we avoid, that the key to a new way of living resides. A way more connected with who we truly are, and with what we need to heal, to move forward in a lighter and more conscious way. As we begin to recognize these fragments that dwell in the shadow, something curious starts to reveal itself. Patterns. Situations that seem to repeat in cycles, as if we were living the same story with different characters. Romantic relationships that end the same way, opportunities that slip through our fingers, conflicts that arise in the same places, even when we change our environment. At first glance, it seems like bad luck, fate, or some kind of misfortune. But the truth is that these patterns are internal scripts trying to resolve themselves. Each repetition carries a message that has yet to be understood. The external world molds itself as a mirror that reflects exactly what hasn't yet been transformed inside. And as painful as it is to admit, it's not always the other person who's wrong, or the scenario that's against us. Often it's our own unconscious trying to confront us with what we've been avoiding. In this context, pain is the persistent echo of a lesson that has yet to be integrated. Recurring arguments, frustrations in relationships, professional failures. All of this may reflect what we project. We project our insecurities onto others and accuse them of not making us feel secure. We project our desire for control and call the other manipulative. It's not easy to see this because it takes courage to take responsibility for what we feel and create. Awareness of these patterns doesn't appear overnight. It usually comes when at some point we get tired of the repetition. When we look back and realize we're always stumbling in the same place. That realization is the key moment, the instant something within us starts to say, "This isn't about others, it's about me." And far from being a burden, that insight brings freedom. Because if the problem is within, so is the solution. Identifying these cycles is a process of listening to what life has been trying to tell us through repetition. Every discomfort is like a handwritten note from our own psyche, asking for attention. And when we stop running from these messages and begin to investigate them with presence, what once seemed like a burden becomes guidance. It's at this point that pain changes its role. It ceases to be a threat and becomes a compass. And the more we learn to decipher these inner signals, the more we can break the cycles that imprison us. This leads us to a kind of freedom that doesn't depend on the outside world, but rather on our willingness to dive deep within ourselves, even when the process is uncomfortable. Because it's there, among the shards of repetition, that true reconstruction begins. After so much resisting, denying, hiding, There comes a moment when we're invited to do something that might seem the opposite of the survival logic we've learned since childhood, to show our vulnerability. And it's in that moment, where everything feels fragile, where we fear being judged or rejected, that we get closer to our deepest truth. We live in a society that teaches us to fake it, to smile even when everything is going wrong, to say I'm fine while carrying storms inside. We show strength like someone wearing armor because we've learned that admitting weakness is the same as putting ourselves at a disadvantage. But it's precisely that armor that, over time, starts to suffocate us. It doesn't protect, it separates us. It distances us from others and, worse, disconnects us from ourselves. When we have the courage to acknowledge that we're confused, tired, lost, something begins to open. The pain that once felt unbearable begins to turn into understanding. We stop fighting against what we feel and start to listen. And in that silence, without so many defenses, a voice that's been long muffled emerges, the voice of our true self. Showing vulnerability doesn't mean falling into self-pity. It's the opposite of playing the victim. It's an act of presence. It's saying, I don't know everything. I make mistakes. I feel fear. And still, I'm here. It's this sincerity that begins the process of individuation, which is the journey of becoming who we truly are, not who others expect us to be. And there's no way to walk this path without facing the fragile parts, without making room for what has always been ignored. When we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we create space for more genuine relationships, deeper connections, and more authentic decisions. Pain ceases to be a silent burden and becomes a bridge between what we try to be for the world and what we truly are inside. And the crossing of that bridge, though uncomfortable, is liberating. At this stage of the journey, we start to realize that we can no longer sustain false versions of ourselves. What was once a mask begins to fall. What was once a pose begins to crumble. Because now, after hearing the call of pain, facing our own patterns, and confronting the shadow, we're standing before what truly transforms us: emotional honesty. And it's that honesty that leads us to the next step, the one where we finally begin to free ourselves from what we've carried for so long. And when, at last, we approach who we are with more honesty and less judgment, we discover an essential ingredient to close this reconnection cycle: forgiveness. But not a superficial forgiveness, the kind said just to end a conversation or ease momentary guilt. We're talking about an internal, silent, profound forgiveness that doesn't seek applause but transforms everything. This kind of forgiveness begins when we acknowledge the weight we carry within us: swallowed anger, lingering guilt, undigested regrets. We hold on to resentments as if they were shields, when in fact they drain our energy, keeping us stuck in old narratives, in roles that no longer make sense. And perhaps the hardest part is forgiving ourselves. For the times we ignored our intuition, repeated patterns knowing where they'd lead, failed to protect ourselves in the name of external approval. But that's exactly where the key to liberation lies. As long as we don't release these internal chains, we continue living in the past. And living in the past is like trying to walk with an anchor tied to your feet. Everything becomes slower, heavier, more exhausting. Forgiveness is the act of releasing that anchor, not to forget what happened, but to stop identifying with the pain that came from it. This movement is not a gesture of weakness, but of strength. To forgive is to refuse to keep feeding the pain. It's choosing not to reduce yourself to the story that hurt you. It's deciding that you will no longer be a hostage of what was, but the author of what can be. That doesn't mean pretending nothing happened. On the contrary, it means looking clearly, acknowledging the impact, accepting the flaws, and still moving forward with lightness. At this point, the entire process begins to come together. The pain that once seemed like punishment reveals itself as the beginning of a calling. The shadow we feared becomes an ally. The patterns that trapped us show what needed to change. Vulnerability presents itself as a bridge to truth, and forgiveness, as the final relief, allows us to breathe without the weight of what we no longer are. By releasing what no longer needs to be carried, we make room for a new version of ourselves to emerge. A more conscious, more whole, more free version. And maybe that's exactly what life was trying to show us all along, that behind the pain, the discomfort, the repetition, there's an invitation, a call to wake up, to finally live, not as a survivor of our own story, but as the protagonist of a new path. If this video touched you in some way, if it made you think differently or look more inward, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps get this message to more people. And if you feel this kind of content does you good, subscribe to the channel. Here we keep diving together into reflections that awaken, comfort, and transform. See you next time.